Story 1. I briefly worked for one of the top Saudi Arabian crown princes in the 1980s. He would buy out the top 3 floors of the best hotels, such as the Four Seasons. 2 floors were for maids, staff, and security, and the top floor was for the royal family. Once it was occupied only by the prince and his 3 wives. It was astonishing. Story 2. I used to work for a billionaire Russian family as a tutor for their daughter. One day, we were in her room studying when she suddenly yelled, "Daddy's home," and ran to the window. She had heard a helicopter and knew it was about to land on the lawn. Story 3. My father's client bought an entire block of houses to build their home. It is so wide that they installed a moving walkway like the ones at airports. Story 4. My grandfather died with a portfolio worth $20 million. He lived in a 1-bedroom condo built in the 1950s, drove a rusted-out Honda, and his entire wardrobe came from Walmart and was about 10 years old. At the will reading, a number of distant relatives showed up hoping to get a share. In his will, he mocked them, then spent 10 pages detailing how he wanted his money distributed among charities and foundations. Some of it was surprising. No one besides him knew he casually owned 160 acres of forested land in Vermont. He donated the land to a land trust which turned it into hiking trails. Story 5. A friend from high school worked for a few years as a deckhand on yachts in the Mediterranean. He said he once jumped in to retrieve a bag belonging to a customer and received a tip of 4,000 euros. He also saw bricks of cocaine brought onto the yacht of P. Diddy. Story 6. I am an art student working as a gardener in one of the wealthiest areas of my country. Some customers eagerly show me the artworks hanging on their walls once they learn I study art. I remember standing in a bathroom in my dirty gardening clothes with a Picasso hanging above the toilet. Story 7. I used to do pool and spa maintenance in my 20s. I worked on one property with a mountainside, a 10-bedroom, 14-bath mansion with a saltwater pool, tennis courts, a guest mansion, and a servant's house that was 4-bedroom, 5-bath. The property had much more, but that isn't the crazy thing. I worked on this property for 2 years, year-round, 5 days a week, and not a single person was ever there. The middle-aged, single woman who owned it lived in a city about 4 hours away and just didn't come because she was so busy with work. A multi-million-dollar compound, just empty. All the time. Finally, after 2 years, I got a call from my boss on my day off. He asked if I could go to the house to put some pool floats away. He apologized because it was my day off, but said the owner would pay me $500 to go put them away. I was surprised there were pool floats at all since nobody was usually there, but I figured what the heck, $500 for 10 minutes. I showed up and the woman's adult children were staying at the house with about 10 children between them, and they were having a massive pool party and cookout. I walked up awkwardly and said to one of the parents, "Sorry, it must be a mistake. I was told to come put pool floats away, but you're obviously here, so I'll leave." The woman's son said, "Oh no, we're getting ready to leave. You can take them." He instructed the kids to push the floats toward me. I grabbed one inner tube and 4 pool noodles, carried them 10 feet into the pool house and put them away. I said they were all set and began to leave. The son thanked me and handed me a folded stack of $20 bills. It was $400. I had expected $500 from my boss, but $400 cash still felt like overpayment, so I didn't mention it. The next day at work, my boss gave me $1,000. I told him the son had already paid me $400, which was fine. He said the owner had called to say how great a job I did, so she decided to pay me $1,000 instead of $500, and the $400 was a tip from her son. 10 minutes of work. She actually called my boss the next day to ask if she should reimburse me for gas, since it was a 15-minute drive from my house. I told him I was all set. Story 8. I worked graveyard shifts as a valet at an ultra-luxury boutique hotel. It is quite shocking how some of these people live, and you would never have a clue by just looking at them on the street. One weekday night, at 2 a.m., a guest asked me to bring around his Bentley. A regular-looking man came out with a backpack, got in and left. Less than 30 minutes later, he returned in a Ferrari with a briefcase. About an hour after that, he ordered 5 shot glasses to his room. When I delivered them, I found two men in robes and two naked women on the couch, with lines of cocaine and alcohol on the coffee table. They tipped me $50 for the shot glasses and I left. 2 hours later, just as the sun was rising, the men emerged together in suits, looking like they were heading to the office. The women left shortly after. Drugs and escorts were not unusual, but the car swap in the middle of the night was strange. Story 9. My dad works in shipping and has many friends who worked on super yachts. In the 1990s, one of his mates was called to bring the yacht of a particular Australian media tycoon and billionaire, not the one you might be thinking of, from Sydney to New York. He was instructed to anchor in a specific bay at an exact time with a lunch spread ready for 50 people. They arrived and set up the food, but the owner never showed. It turned out he was hosting a wealthy party in a building overlooking the harbor and wanted to be able to point down and say, "That is my boat." He had the lunch ready in case he decided to take his rich friends down to the yacht, but he did not feel like it that day, so all the food was wasted and they sailed back to Australia without seeing him. Story 10. I had a classmate whose parents were filthy rich from family money. I can't remember which parent, but they were amazing people. At university, a girl in our class who was really nice but came from a poor family dropped her MacBook. She had worked 60 hours a week for 3 months in the summer to afford it. He came up, gave her his MacBook, and said he would just get a new one after school. His parents would not care. It was pure generosity. There was no TikTok video or attention seeking. He was a stellar person, spending his parents' money only on things for other people in a genuinely helpful way. He also bought suits for all the guys in class for graduation. Many people were planning to rent suits, and he told everyone he knew a place with nice suits. We rented one for about €100, everything included, and when we returned them we found out he had paid for all of them. He said renting was wasteful and buying was expensive, so this gave us the best of both worlds. The last thing I heard was that he bought about 10 PlayStation 5 consoles from scalpers and sold them at retail price to kids in the neighborhood. I should have stayed friends with him. Story 11. I worked at a restaurant where a few of the regulars were the children of billionaires. I overheard a student from China studying in the United States say, "I told my parents that my tuition costs $500,000. After being asked how she had so much money. Another time, while serving a table, I was asked to bring a tray of 60 patron shots, $600, for a 19-year-old student. I must have had an incredulous look on my face, because his only response to assuage my concern was, "My father owns diamond mines in Africa." Story 12. My dad used to work for a private airfield. They had many people fly in, but the wealthier clients usually arrived at night. I remember one time in high school I had to do a job shadow and went to work with my dad. The owner of a California airport flew in for the weekend. My job was to stand outside with an umbrella. His wife tipped me $20 and said the sandwich trays were real silver and I should help myself. After they got in their car, I asked my dad what she meant. Apparently, when wealthier people fly in, they let the plane detailers keep the platters and other serving items. I always wondered how we ended up with so many strange serving trays. Another time when I visited him at work, I got to hold an albino kangaroo. It was the most adorable and softest animal I have ever touched. Story 13. A friend did some work on Sylvester Stallone's home. Apparently there are a lot of statues and works of art depicting him, some of which are nude and very well endowed. Story 14. I attended a New England preparatory school on a full-ride sports scholarship. There were a number of foreign students, mainly from Asia, who came from extremely wealthy families. The parents of one of those students bought him a brand new Bavarian Motor Works 5 Series, fully loaded, when he got his license during our junior year. When we graduated a year later, he was returning to Korea and could not take the car, so he gave it to his best friend. The friend received an $80,000 car at 17 years old simply for being friends with the right person. I will never forget that. Story 15. This was ages ago. I worked in a digital versatile disc store. A woman came in with 5 A4 size pages, double-sided, of movie titles and asked me to fetch what we had. I ran around and collected digital versatile discs and Blu-ray discs worth close to 1,000. I asked what they were for. She was the personal assistant for a billionaire and was getting them for his yacht. Story 16. A woman who owned a small private jet company told me that someone once paid about $45,000 to fly their dog alone to New York for training. Story 17. I tutored a wealthy 5-year-old. I was paid well to spend an hour drawing, coloring, and playing with this kindergartner, all in French. By age 5, he had been to more places than I will probably visit in my lifetime. The best part of the job was the perks. They took my partner and me to fancy restaurants and always paid the bill. They invited us to try delicacies they prepared. They always hosted house guests with impressive resumes. For example, once they hosted a Dutch diplomat. They owned homes in my city and in San Francisco and traveled between them frequently. They invited me on several occasions, but I never had time to go. I also befriended and stayed with the daughter of Russian oligarchs who lived in Paris. Her mother was a famous writer and her father worked in business. Her grandfather was a famous Soviet writer, so the family led a very cultured life. They lived in Neuilly-sur-Seine, one of Paris's wealthiest neighborhoods, and owned homes in the Alps, Crimea, and Moscow. The sad part was that she had only a few career options. She could become a doctor, a lawyer, or a business executive. Their son was fortunate to study at the Geneva Conservatory, but that was only because he was exceptionally talented. In this family, if you did not have natural artistic talent, those 3 career paths were the only options. I had the impression that she was depressed about her limited options and the pressure to succeed. Story 18. I used to work for a company that modified aircraft for very wealthy clients. I'm talking Boeing 747s, not Gulfstreams. The company had made several aircraft for one customer. I was told he had purchased a new one solely because his spiritual advisor said one of his current planes was bad luck. He still let his wife use it for her personal travel. One of the most exquisite features of these planes was not the gold-plated everything or the rare wood veneers. It was the silk carpet. That material cost over $1,000 per square foot and feels like walking on a bed of angel feathers harvested in the most inhumane way possible. The manufacturers did not deck out the whole plane. They only outfitted the personal areas. The aft third is usually reserved for staff and is more like a fancy economy class. But yes, silk carpet. Story 19. I became friends with my boss and his wife. They were very nice people. His wife turned out to be an heiress and would buy me whatever I mentioned in passing during a conversation. I learned that gifts were the way she had been raised to show love. I have trained myself to talk only about things I already own, unless I find something useful she might like and suggest it to her. Story 20. I have been working for the super rich for some time. The craziest thing I have seen was a brand new 90-meter multi-million pound sterling yacht built in the Netherlands. Its maiden voyage was to Antibes, France. The owner came aboard and left after a few hours. The next week we were sent to Genoa, Italy, where all the bathrooms were ripped out and upgraded. That did not sound like a big deal, but I am talking about brand new marble sinks, showers, floors, and lobbies all crowbarred out and thrown into skips. Tons of polished marble were binned. New marble colors and patterns arrived in the following weeks. There is feed me money, fuck you money, and it is not even a thought money. Story 21. I used to work for an Arab billionaire's son, a daddy's money guy, a terrible human being. I once saw him spend $16,000 on a wallet, a fancy one with small gold spikes. He also wore shoes with gold on them. One year for his birthday, he received more than 30 large, ornate cakes and told us to leave them in the hallway outside his room. We walked past those cakes every day for 2 weeks waiting for instructions. After 2 weeks, we were told to throw them away. Story 22. When wealthy people want to buy a Jaguar in the United Kingdom, they are assigned a dedicated salesperson who is highly knowledgeable. They meet in a private office and special arrangements can be made. This was my friend Chris's job. He had access to things that a normal Jaguar salesperson would not, such as the ability to contact the factory manager for special requests. A Saudi prince wanted to buy the new Jaguar model that had just been released. They met and spent a full day specifying the car. I believe the final price was about £125,000 for the vehicle. Then came the decision about color. At the time, the factory offered 16 color choices for this model. The prince asked if he could sleep on it, since it was getting late and almost time for dinner and prayer. Chris agreed, and they set a time to meet the next morning. The next morning, the prince said he had an acceptable solution to his color dilemma. Chris asked what it would be. The prince replied that he would order one of each color. Chris accepted. They discussed delivery time and options. The prince was presented with ocean transport choices and asked about air cargo. Chris assumed they might ship 1 or 2 by air and the rest by sea. The prince said he wanted all 16 vehicles loaded on a plane and flown to Saudi Arabia. That is how 16 identical Jaguars in different colors were flown to Saudi Arabia at a total cost of about £2. 5 million. Story 23. Keith Urban tipped me $7 for a $4 shake and left the keys to his Bentley at the store, but he came back and retrieved them. Story 24. I am a driving instructor. A group rented the track to drive their supercars. At the end of the session, they paired up, got into their cars, and left. After they had gone, we realized they had left their Lamborghini Aventador at the track. Story 25. I was the boyfriend of a girl from an obscenely rich family. The sister had the nanny fly to Paris in their Gulfstream G550 private jet to buy the newest Hermes bag so she could show it off a few days before it went on sale in the United States. The nanny was sleeping with the husband, but that is another story. Story 26. Some extremely wealthy people I have been around have a more acute sense of their own time and mortality, which makes them impatient. They understand how fortunate their lives are and therefore how short they feel. I knew a man whose vintage yacht broke down before summer, so he bought another one strictly for that upcoming season. He reasoned that he likely had 20 healthy summers left and did not want to spend one without a boat, given that he had the means. I cannot argue with that logic. Story 27. I used to pet sit. I remember a wealthy person asking me to pet sit their cat. There were televisions in almost every room. The strangest was the cat bathroom. A television played cat cartoons. There was an overly fancy litter box and paintings of cats. Story 28. Family friends were having marital problems. Their counselor determined many of their arguments were about cooking and reminded them they could afford to have their meals catered, which would be cheaper than a divorce. They followed the advice and are happily married again. Story 29. I worked for United Parcel Service for a short time as a driver helper and saw some interesting things. One driver had the richest route, with mansions worth tens of millions around Ann Arbor, Michigan. There was the Ford mansion, Lloyd Carr, and Dave Brandon, who also worked for Little Caesars. I got to see Dave Brandon's mansion. It was gated, deep in the woods, and absolutely huge. The driver, a 33-year United Parcel Service veteran, told me that people with mansions like that often do not live there alone. Sometimes they do not live there at all. They move their extended families in: parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, and everyone lives off the rich person's money, ordering whatever they want whenever they want. I think we delivered 30 or 40 packages there that day. On the same day, with the same driver, we delivered to a smaller but still huge house with an extremely long wooded driveway. The driver complained because the owners always parked a very large boat in the only possible turnaround point. He backed the truck in and accelerated to about 40 miles per hour in reverse for roughly 250 yards through curves and straight sections. He drove it perfectly, never going off or missing the driveway. At the door, the driver said we just needed a signature and would be on our way. The person who answered was maybe in his late 40s or early 50s, short and balding, very thin, wearing thick glasses, a Rick Moranis, George Costanza type. He stood in the doorway with a Labrador on a leash. The man said he could not sign because he had to take his dog out first. He was prepared to make us wait while the dog did its business before simply signing and letting us drop the package. The driver insisted we only needed a signature and could leave right away. The man took the 2 seconds to sign, we left the package, and we were on our way. That left an impression on me. He valued our time so little that it was worth less than his dog's waste. As if we were not delivering 300 stops just before Christmas. Story 30. My wife's aunt and uncle were busy the entire day on their 25th anniversary and returned home at about 9 in the evening. They decided the kids needed a bit of fun, so they booked a private jet to Moscow and spent a week there. They live in Paris. Money. Got to love it. Story 31. I've worked with some fairly wealthy people in the developing world, more or less new money, people who have been successful in some business ventures. Overall, they are a bit out of touch with the realities of the world. I used to think they were naive as well, because I saw many other people taking advantage of them or outright robbing them. Over time, I realized that, while this is not entirely untrue, the situation is more complicated. They did fail to notice a lot of unprofessional behavior by the people they hired, but not all of it. What they did notice, they wrote off as the cost of finding people they could trust with projects that were actually important to them and to work with for years. So you could overbill them a few $1,000s once or twice, but if you worked hard and delivered results, you could bootstrap your whole business to the next level with just them as a client. Eventually, I realized they valued trust far more than money. They made their money with fairly long-term, high-risk, high-reward ventures running in parallel, for example, research. So it all made more sense. I also know many wealthy but useless people, though not very well. A lot of wealth in Asia is inherited, and cash flow is a difficult matter here. Some people assume they are important because they were born rich and behave foolishly. They do some wild things, but I do not stay around to hear about it. Story 32. My great-uncle was very well off. He did not have a guest house. He had a guest mansion separate from his main house for when his children dropped by. That does not include the Olympic-sized indoor pool, which was in a separate building. He bought a cannon and used it to shoot at the mountain behind his house, firing brand new special bowling balls that cost $100 each. I am not sure of the actual size of the pool, but it was definitely larger than most community pools. If you want to see the cannon in action, Nitro Circus filmed an episode in which they shot a car with it. I did not expect this story to draw so much attention, so I did not initially mention that he also used it as a human slingshot. There are a few viral videos of that. Story 33. I worked at a resort and marina that dealt with high-end boats, from mega yachts to brand new cigarette boats. Always assume the quiet man with the stained shirt is the owner of the performance boat. Never expect tips from mega yachts. The most narcissistic guests were surgeons. The angriest guests were lawyers. No offense to attorneys, I am one. The richest were in construction and commercial real estate. The best tippers were men entertaining their mistresses on their boats when you knew who their wives were. Story 34. Nothing too fancy, but I used to help build multimillion-dollar homes about a decade ago. One couple, a neurosurgeon and a dentist, had an office with a bookcase door leading under the stairs. They stored their surround sound equipment and a safe there. Another house belonged to a micromanaging woman and her husband. She regularly came to the site and ordered the workers around while the foreman sighed and rolled his eyes. At one point, he had to order her off the site because she was a safety hazard. That couple also had a creepy setup for their children. 2 bunk beds on either side of a wall, and both rooms led to a bathroom facing the road with a large bay window next to the tub. Anyone driving or walking past or a neighbor could see the children bathing. Story 35. I used to install DirecTV in wealthy areas of an East Coast city in the United States. While I tried to give customers options for where I installed the satellite dish, I had to get a good line of sight for it to work properly, so sometimes the location options were limited. At one wealthy woman's house, a gorgeous home right on the beach, I found only 2 good spots for the dish: on a pole in the middle of her backyard or on the corner of the roof. She definitely did not want it in the middle of her yard. The only problem was that she had a metal roof, and we used specific mounting hardware for that. We were back-ordered on that hardware for a few weeks. When I informed her, she became visibly upset that she would have to wait that long to get her service working. I apologized and told her she would need to reschedule a few weeks later, and I left. 3 days later, I was looking over my work orders, and I noticed her name and address. I thought she had requested a different installer who she could try to convince to give her a different answer. I was wrong. When I pulled up to the house, there was a brand new shingle roof. I installed the dish on the roof. Story 36. I live near a company that builds yachts. One day I saw an odd-looking yacht. A crew member explained that it was a shadow yacht. When you become very wealthy and own multiple yachts, you do not want to spoil the appearance of your main yachts with jet skis or helicopters. Nor do you want your crew sleeping aboard the main yacht. So you buy a shadow yacht to store your toys and to house your crew. The shadow yacht follows your fleet of main yachts. Story 37. My partner once helped build a $350,000 pergola. It was built from mahogany imported from Fiji because they could not source solid beams elsewhere, and we were in the middle of the Midwest. It was then painted because the color did not suit the homeowner. I still think about the fact that our beautiful historic home, which we are lucky enough to own, was still more than $100,000 cheaper than this person's glorified outdoor stick fort. Story 38. The client was a multimillionaire in the 1960s, so he was even wealthier when I met him. He rode the bus to the office every day for the free coffee. He founded a company whose name was emblazoned on shipping containers transported by tractor trailers across the United States and used in international shipping and logistics. He came to the financial offices for the coffee, never discussing his finances, and then quickly left. Story 39. Some children develop plans and strategies they practice to avoid abduction or harm from stalkers. A child I worked with was the child of a prominent Hollywood figure. People stalked him to get to the parent. An intruder brandishing a screenplay broke in and cornered the child. I thought I would have to throw myself between them, but the child dove into a nearby dog kennel and locked himself inside. He could not get out, but the intruder could not get in either. The intruder threw the screenplay into the kennel. Meanwhile, I called the police. I was so impressed by the child's quick thinking that I asked how he got the idea. He said that he always looks for a way to escape, and when he sees someone he does not know approach, he gets ready to run. I felt awful that the child had to live like that. If I had not seen it myself, I would have thought it was just paranoia. Story 40. I work at a university satellite campus where a billionaire has donated several buildings. He drives through occasionally to see them, stops to chat with staff, and sometimes gives us tickets to games in the arena he donated. This attracted more attention than I expected. No one has guessed his name. He keeps a low profile, so you would not recognize his name unless you were familiar with the situation. Story 41. A rich broker I worked with got a divorce. His wife wanted $30,000 a month per child in child support. His lawyer convinced him it was a good deal and that he should accept it. He asked me whether $30,000 a month was a lot of money. I told him that was more than I make in an entire year. He said, "Fuck. I can't believe I have such a shitty lawyer." He was a cool guy. I had to send him pants overnight because somehow he ended up in Scotland. It was cold, and he could not be bothered to go shopping. He had a house in Santa Barbara that had been given to his first ex-wife. She stopped paying taxes on it, and it became essentially an abandoned mansion. He sent his assistant to check it, and there was a family of raccoons living inside. He really liked Grey's Anatomy and needed ice for his Diet Coke. So the office bought a $1,000 ice machine on the off chance he showed up. Story 42. He hired someone to use his credit card and create and pay for an entirely fake, very expensive trip to Europe so he could go to Mexico with his mistress at the same time. He was in the middle of a divorce and did not want any evidence of the affair affecting the proceedings, so he had an alibi fabricated. Story 43. An old high school teacher of mine is an extremely successful private tutor who works a lot in the affluent neighborhoods nearby. He once told us he was tutoring a student and helped him prepare for and pass his college-level physics class. At the end of their last session, the student asked him to wait, went into his father's office, and came out with his payment plus an extra $1,000. My teacher tried to refuse, saying it was too much, but the student said his father had asked him to give a tip. Story 44. As a chef, I have seen, heard, and accommodated all sorts of bizarre requests. Michael J. Fox's child loves overcooked spaghetti with ketchup. Run DMC dips shrimp tempura in ketchup. Drake will only eat well-done steak. Bill Gates is surprisingly casual, and Larry Ellison goes out of his way to thank the staff and even to toast with Louis XIII. Migos brought Dino nuggets for us to cook. Adam Devine has paid tabs for the entire restaurant. Snoop Dogg left blunts in the kitchen. Kanye West eats breakfast alone. I snuck Dirt Nasty into a private party. The list goes on. Story 45. My dad delivered a pizza to Rob Dyrdek. Rob tipped him $100 and apparently farted, thinking it would be silent, but it was not. Story 46. I had a client who lived just outside New York City. They were new money in an area that was mostly old money. They disliked their neighbors but were polite face to face. Whenever a neighbor's wife bought something to show off, they bought a more expensive or rarer version, or two of the same if that was not possible. Most of the items were displayed in the front room. The client's wife called it the show-off room. They were a bit eclectic but really nice people. Story 47. I dated a woman who did interior design for a middle-tier Silicon Valley developer. Middle-tier meaning speculative homes in the $2 million range, which was a nice house 19 years ago. Of course, now $2 million gets you a hovel with a nice paint job. The ultimate stove to have was a La Cornu, the one sold at Williams-Sonoma with lots of brass and enamel. They were $20,000 and had a multi-year wait. She figured out that she could go to France and get them in about 6 weeks for $10,000 plus shipping. That was most of her design work. Vacationing in France and buying stoves. Story 48. When I was a chauffeur and ski companion for a very wealthy man, he sent me to buy a birthday present for his daughter when she turned 17. This was in the 1970s. I bought her a new 2002 from Bayerisch Motor in Huerca and told the dealer to charge it to him. Later the dealer offered me an incredible deal on a trade-in. A cream puff that had only been driven to church on Sundays. $500 for a really good late-model used car, although it was an American car they did not normally handle. 30 years later, I was working with an architect building a house for another very wealthy man. The library was to be paneled in knotty pine. The man's wife arrived when it was almost finished and said there were too many knots. We ripped out the whole interior, and the man, who owned several sawmills, sent back to the mill to ship another truckload so we could select the boards under his wife's direction. The same wife, in the same house, could not figure out how to turn the car around in the triple-wide driveway. So he had a turntable installed in the garage, so she only had to avoid the edges of the door when entering or leaving. Story 49. My grandpa was a piano tuner. He couldn't drive because of epilepsy, so the family would take him to jobs. One day my dad took him to a job and talked to the owner. The owner lived in the largest, nicest mansion my dad had ever seen. Everything in the house was very expensive, but the owner and his wife were down to earth and normal, if a bit rough around the edges. Finally, his curiosity got the better of him and my dad asked how they made their money. The man said he used to drive a truck and got tired of having to carry bottles of ketchup. That's how my dad met the creator of the ketchup packet. Story 50. I have worked for some of the wealthiest people in Maryland. One that stands out is a doctor I worked for in Montgomery County, in one of the most affluent postal codes in the United States. He owned a large number of offices around the District of Columbia area, with many employees, associate doctors, and staff. He was extremely wealthy. A huge garage full of very expensive cars, several Ferraris, an art collection, a wine cellar, the works. I did information technology work for his medical practice and managed all the servers and other systems, and occasionally went to their house because I was the lead administrator. Once I was working in his house and walking around upstairs near the bedrooms. He was lying in bed being fed by an assistant. Someone was hand-feeding him a full meal, steak, soup, salad. He never used his hands. He was extremely strange. It reminded me of the behavior of a dictator who expects to be treated like a king. There was nothing sexual about it. Keep in mind, this was a man in his 50s who was in fine physical shape and did not need a caregiver. It was pure opulence. Another time I was working in the kitchen and his young son, probably in his late teens or early 20s, walked past me and smelled strongly of marijuana. We joked about it. He poured an India Pale Ale into a glass and took it back to his room at 9 in the morning. I found it hysterical. He seemed like a cool kid from my interactions with him, probably unconcerned because his father was so wealthy, so he was very laid back. I have some other strange stories, but that is by far the strangest. Story 51. The entire basement was full of items his wife had bought. Furniture, clothing, and boxes of belongings, mostly from Neiman Marcus, Nordstrom, and similar specialty stores. Online shopping was not as common then. He told me she had million-miler status on American Airlines just from purchases on her credit card. They had separate accounts. At the time, credit card purchases were credited as if you had flown the miles. Story 52. I started working for this couple's company and was accepted by their 2 Irish wolfhounds. Something the owner said had never happened before except with him and his partner. They hired me to come over after work to brush, walk, medicate, and feed the dogs, and to take one of their high-end spare cars to pick up bulk orders of diced mutton, more than 100 kilograms at a time, from a butcher on the other side of town. They gave me the keys to their heritage-listed home in an affluent area while they were away so I could take care of the dogs and sleep over if I wanted. They were both lovely people, very wealthy but time-poor, and always treated me with respect and friendliness. They bought a brand new Toyota Troop Carrier for the dogs because 2 wolfhounds would not fit in his Porsche or her Mercedes. I loaded the dogs into the Troop Carrier and drove to a nearby beach once a month so they could run, play, and splash in the sea. I would then bathe them, feed them, tuck them in, and return home. They slept on a large, very expensive leather sofa on the back deck that had been replaced with a newer, smaller one inside the house. They often asked me to dispose of old furnishings. When I asked if I could keep some items, they said yes. Take what I wanted and discard the rest. They only wanted the things gone, and I had their blessing to sell the rest and keep the proceeds. For someone earning less than 50,000 Australian dollars a year, this was a godsend. My shabby house benefited greatly from their cast-off rugs and furnishings. I was grateful and they were happy. They had complete faith and trust in me, which was astonishing, especially when I was asked to take over processing the staff payroll for the company. It felt unreal. Thanks, Jeff and Helen. Story 53. My cousin works at a high-end worldwide hotel chain in a large United States city. A couple of years ago, a random man approached him and asked for a dinner suggestion, saying price was not a concern. My cousin kept up with city trends, knew some restaurant owners, and gave the man a suggestion. The next day, the man asked for him by name, gave him $100, said dinner was amazing, and asked where they should eat that night. After another suggestion, he received another $100 the next day. This time his manager noticed and asked if he knew who the guest was. He did not. I will not say the name, but it was old money, likely with a net worth in the hundreds of millions. A couple of months later, my cousin was told the person would call at 6 in the evening and wanted to speak only with him. The conversation was short. The guest said they would be in town next month for 4 nights and asked him to book 4 excellent dinners for 6 people because they trusted his judgment. He was given the email address of their family assistant and told to coordinate the plans with that person. When the family arrived, they greeted him at check-in and said they were looking forward to the dinners. For days later, when they checked out, they handed him $1,000 as a thank you for his local knowledge. Story 54. I used to work in business aviation. Someone wrote poor people suck on a small spot on the tail of a private jet. It was probably the most tasteless thing I saw. I also had a woman arrive on a charter who panicked because she could not remember where she had left her Range Rover. It was hours after closing and she had no information about where it might be. I deduced she had probably departed from the other side of the airport and I found her car for her. They never tipped and were regular late-night call-ins. Story 55. A Russian man I sometimes work for bought a house in Mugens on the French Riviera. He never visited before buying. He decided he liked it from the photos and paid 11 million euros. When he arrived, he thought the view was spoiled by another house that barely blocked the sea. He sent his lawyer to offer 4 million euros to the owners. They declined. He doubled the offer. They declined again. He doubled it again, and this time they accepted. He demolished that house the day he got the keys and built an underground parking lot for the cars he said he would not be using much there. He paid more for that distant house than for the one he plans to spend his summers in, simply to make it disappear, and he laughed the whole time when he told me. Story 56. My cousin was a caretaker for a wealthy woman in Beverly Hills. While the woman was alive, my cousin did not know how to cook. So the woman flew a chef from Paris first class and had him stay at a nearby hotel. The chef came to the employer's house every day and taught my cousin to cook. While they were watching television, my cousin remarked that the newest Mercedes-Benz in the commercial was nice. When the chef came to work the next day, the woman bought that top-of-the-line car for him. Ever since then, my cousin had to be careful about what he said. They later returned the car. The woman had a tennis court at her house. I believe Rafael Nadal once played there. A Kardashian dog sometimes came into their yard. My cousin has a daughter. The daughter has a trust and can attend any school from elementary through university with tuition fully paid. Sadly, the woman died a couple of years ago and left them about $20 million US. I think the grandchildren are still fighting in court over it. The $20 million was in the will and, I believe, included a no contest clause. Story 57. I was catering a wedding in a family's second kitchen at their home. Though this was the lesser kitchen, the entire wall opened to an infinity pool that overlooked the ocean from a cliff. As we were prepping, a little girl who was the family's youngest daughter came skipping into the room. She looked to be about 6 or 7 years old. She helped herself to some pastries we had prepared for later without asking, then walked up to me with wide eyes and asked if I cooked for a living. Thinking she was impressed, I replied that I did and that it was a lot of fun. Without hesitating, she said that it sucked and skipped away. Story 58. We used to close off the corridors beneath the hotel so guests could enter and exit without being seen. They were mainly celebrities and other very wealthy people who did not want attention. Few unusual incidents occurred, but it always made me wonder who was moving around beneath the hotel where I was staying. The most memorable night was when a detective arrived with 2 older adults. I knew them immediately. I grew up in Florida. They stayed for about 3 nights, and their stay was paid for by federal agents. We took care of Casey Anthony's parents. Story 59. I do not cater to wealthy people, but a couple of years ago I had an experience with a wealthy friend that I will never forget. He had one of those high-end black credit cards, and he invited me and another friend to travel with him and paid for most of the expenses. His son, who has special needs and sometimes has episodes, did not want to stay at the Waldorf Astoria we had just arrived at. My friend called his credit card manager and, 3 minutes later, said that luckily we had not unpacked because we were staying at the Beverly Wilshire. My credit card gives me a movie ticket each month if I spend more than $500. That is nice too. Story 60. An acquaintance of mine was building a house for a married couple who hated each other. The husband was too wealthy to get divorced, so they had separate elevators installed to ensure they would never have to see each other. Story 61. Until recently, I worked on the bread and pastry team at a very high-end restaurant in Los Angeles. Besides the bread served before the meal, we had to make burger buns. Burgers were not on the menu, but we kept buns stocked in the freezer in case a very important person wanted a burger. There was one regular who ordered burgers but only as sliders, so we made slider buns for him. God forbid we tell a wealthy guest, "I'm sorry, we don't have hamburgers here." Story 62. This is not my story. I met someone who worked as a travel chef for a branch of an Arab royal family, which I will not name. They were reportedly the only people in the United States allowed to fly on September 11, 2001, when all other air traffic was grounded. She had many strange stories, but what stuck with me was an infant that all the servants called the football because that is how the child was treated. No one interacted with the baby on a human level, servants or family. The child was treated like a piece of luggage that had to be regularly tended so it would not die. Story 63. Okay, I would say that a bed that costs $10,000 or more is absolutely lovely. Story 64. I worked for the sister of a billionaire doing odd jobs that eventually expanded to working for her friends and family. People with single-digit millions spend recklessly, always trying to show off their wealth. People with double-digit millions are a mixed bag. People in the 100 million to 1 billion range were fascinating because the ones I worked for were remarkably frugal. If you remove the business aspect, they were normal people, not pretentious jerks. They did not care about appearances anymore. They drank $50 bottles of liquor, not $1,000 scotch. They preferred pizza to a catered meal. They bought the home with the best view, not the biggest house. Their big purchases were also investments. They might own a professional golfers association course but use a $2,000 set of clubs because they liked the fit. They would make a $50 million deal in khaki shorts, sandals, and a t-shirt. I never heard a raised voice. Every request was prefaced with please and often followed by genuine thanks. I was shocked. Not the demeanor I had anticipated. The most common thing I saw was terrible children. Just absolute abominations of people. Demanding and not worthy of the empires their parents built. Story 65. My niece married an absurdly rich man. His quirk was that he did everything possible to hide his fortune. Simple clothes, an ordinary car, a decent but not lavish house, and a modest allowance. He literally hates his fellow multimillionaires with a passion. He told a story from when he was really into Formula One. His father bought him a karting track. Long story short, he got very good and won several small championships, earning a spot in a training camp with some current Formula One professionals. As soon as people realized he came from money, would-be trainers, other kids, and almost everyone started treating him differently, saying he was not good enough and that his success had been bought. That pattern repeated itself. At Oxford University, where he earned a scholarship rather than paying, and in business deals where people tried to extract more because they assumed he was wealthy. Gold diggers tried to enter his life for the money. Instead of becoming a cynical Scrooge, he and his family simply hid their wealth. They wanted normal lives and honest human interactions. Story 66. I deliver for Uber Eats, so I often find myself in wealthy neighborhoods. One gated property lights its driveway like a magazine spread at night, with a fountain illuminated and a Cadillac Escalade on each side of the driveway parked at an angle with their lights on. The two Escalades mirror each other. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.